Hello and welcome to A Sense of Centerville in Washington Township, your place for stories about ordinary and extraordinary residents and places in the Centerville and Washington Township area. I'm Susan from Centerville-Washington History, and I look forward to hearing your story. Today my guest is Brian Forschner. Brian was the co-founder and first executive director of St Leonard Center and subsequently president of Mercy Senior Health and Housing Services. He is a fourth-generation Daytonian and married to wife Joyce for 50 years. Brian has a Ph.D. from OSU and is an author, photographer, and runner. Today, Brian shares the history of St Leonard's. Thanks for being here today.
Good to be here.
And let me just tell our listeners a little bit about how this interview came about. Brian was giving a presentation at St Leonard's about the history of how St Leonard's came into being, and the curator of our museum was there and listening. And when she was describing it, I thought it would be an interesting interview, a chance for the residents of the community to hear about that story. I know I've driven past St Leonard's many times in the 27 years that I've lived here, and hearing a little bit more about the history and how it came about was very helpful to me. Let's talk about how you became familiar with St Leonard's.
Well, I became familiar when at the grand opening in 1958, when it was opened as in a seminary. It was a seminary for where Franciscans would become priests. They would do the last 4 years of their study there from all over the country. So, they were busing out young boys like myself, hoping they would become Franciscans, and to an open house. So I went out there for an open house, and I remember getting ice cream served to me by a big, robust African-American friar in the kitchen, whose picture eventually ended up in the chapel wall there. He's like one of the centurions at the foot of the cross. So if you go see some of there's some wonderful art there. So that's where I first became acquainted. And the next time I was there on a retreat with as a member of the Social Action and World Peace Commission for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, which was basically a group that looked at, matter of fact, in those days we were looking at boycotting Nestle's for their peddling, trying to discourage women from breastfeeding in Africa. I mean, we were on all kinds of issues. So we were on a retreat there, and we found out that the seminary had closed. This was in 1981, and that it was for sale. And at the time, I was there were three of us that are part of this story. Sister Rose Wildenhouse, who was a Precious Blood nun, who was on that board, the Social Action Commission, and Dick McBride, who worked for Avico at the time, that we all teased him because Avico, I think, made bombs for the government or military equipment. But so, and myself, and I was running a group of halfway houses for federal and state prisoners in town. So we were. And Dick was also on my board there, so we were also thinking about expanding our halfway house group also at the time. So one of the friars there, Father Maynard, who is still alive and lives in Cincinnati, came up to us and told us if it was for sale. Now this is a big building here. This isn't like your duplex somewhere. So he said, yeah, he had shown it. There was 40 corporations that expressed an interest. Now, the seminary is a 174,000 square foot building that sits on 240 acres. So it was a big piece of property. And he had 21 companies interested.
So the companies probably were going to knock it down and use the property for something else.
Yeah, well, he had actually just completed the sale. He was going on sabbatical but his boss told him at the last minute, why don't you wait and sell this property before you leave?
Okay.
Because he had just sold Duns Scotus College, which was very similar in Detroit, and did not quite as much property, and they had sold it to a Pentecostal group that had. So my point here is that the Friars had made a clear decision to sell that property, and the money was going to go to the poor. No matter what happened, all the money there would go to the poor. Or if for some reason there was some way to use the property for the poor, they were going to do that. So when he told us that, we were mildly surprised, and so it got our wheels churning. We said, well, I wonder what this, we were thinking of, at Cope, which I think is still in existence in town, we were thinking of expanding, similar to Talbert House in Cincinnati. Talbert House actually founded Cope in Dayton, to like a multiple social service agencies that would have homeless and offenders and unwed mothers, or not battered wives, all kinds of things like that. So we started to meet in the basement of Corpus Christi Church over in Lower Dayton View, or no, I guess it's Lower Dayton View, Forest and Five Oaks, right around there. And for months, we would meet there on the weekends and putting up print sheets on the walls, trying to dream up how we might use that building and property. Mm-hmm. And all kinds of things. And then we would run these proposals by Father Maynard, who was the man in charge of selling. And he was mildly interested, and then after a while he got a little more interested, and we kept refining it because he says, like, what is it that they're looking for? And they really weren't looking for anything. They were pretty much dead set on selling the place. So we finally got to a point that, it was brought to our attention that the Montgomery County Regional Planning Commission had just completed a study, this was in 81, stating that there was a need for in the 5-county area, that there was a need for about 14,000 beds or units of housing for seniors, low-income seniors. So we looked at that and thought that might have some possibilities. So finally, we got a proposal that included housing and a wide variety of other things and renting the building out to people. In the interim, while this was going on, the Friars actually rented one of their wings over there to the city of Centerville for a senior center, because Centerville did not have a senior citizen center. So this was kind of, while this was going on, maybe an anticipation of what might happen in the future. So they rented one of the rooms. So that became one of the, that was just great to have a senior citizen center in a retirement home that we were contemplating. So we gave them a proposal and pestered them. And Dick was vice president for marketing for EFCO. So he traveled all over the country, and anytime he was in anywhere near where a Franciscan was stationed, he was on them. He was trying to sell this thing. So he was just relentless. He was just a great soul. He and Rose both. And so finally they said, and in the interim, I've been down to the archives in Cincinnati, because I never did understand why these 3 people, they would decide to give a huge building and property and trust 3 people with it. It never quite added up. So, one of the big issues was the market was very depressed, and they could not get out of that property what they wanted. So it just wasn't going where they wanted to go. So this looked like maybe an option to use the property for the poor. So in going on early 82, they gave us a 90-day option. And we had to fulfill 3 requirements for it. One was we had to raise $600,000 in cash. Now this was before crowdsourcing. This was before the internet. This was before a lot of things. And it was just the 3 of us. Have a feasibility study conducted to show that this project is even feasible. And third, get it rezoned in Centerville because it had to be rezoned for conditional usage. So we began, and Sister Rose, who was an incredible individual, she had been a principal, and she, at that point in time, she was like head of the local Precious Blood Sisters region. They had a place out on Salem Avenue called Maria Joseph, and it's still there, but it's a retirement community. I think it's still there. Anytime I come to Dayton and I say, is that still there? And they look at me and say, no. It's not there anymore. Are the people there? No, they're not there either. So
things change.
Yeah, things change. But she was also on the board of the Leadership Council for Women Religious. In those days, women religious were starting to become very interested in doing other things than they had done in the past. Whereas they were housekeepers or maybe teaching and whatever, these were women who were they were professional women who wanted to do. They were much more liberated. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. So she had her hands. So she knew these folks. So we needed to raise $600,000. So the first thing, plus these orders were also because of one of the Vatican councils had encouraged religious orders to take a look at their investments and be a little more focused towards justice and not just getting income off of your investments in the stock market. So something they called alternate investments, where you would put, case in point, she went to her order and asked them for $100,000, and so they gave us $100,000 at 10-year loan, no interest, and no payments for 10 years. So there was our first
give you a chance to try to.
Then she went to the Marianists at the University of Dayton, and she went to the Sisters of St. Joseph of Cincinnati, who became, I think most people would know something about they run McNicholas High School, but just shortly after that, one of their nuns wrote a book called Dead Man Walking.
Oh, wow.
It was made into a movie.
Yeah, it's familiar.
And they gave $100,000, same terms, no interest payments for 10 years, or no interest and no payments for 10 years. Then we went to the Marianists. Marianists said, because she said the men need to cough up. And they said no initially, since they had, because one of the things is when you're going to a foundation at the last minute, we went to NCR too, and NCR couldn't give us in because they plan years in advance. Mm-hmm. And that was a lot of money for them.
And you had 90 days to.
And we had 90 days to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So, but we got a call, it wasn't but a few weeks later, from them saying that some money had freed up because they sold property that used to be Mount St. John's, which is now Bergamo. They had a big dairy farm out there, and they sold it to a group called the Research Park, which I think is still the Research Park. And they gave us $100,000 for the same terms. Then we received, I think, about $50,000 from Sisters of Notre Dame, and from the Notre Dame, the Sisters of Charity. So these different religious orders were putting investing in people, pulling that money out of the market, those alternate type investments. So we quickly got to $600,000, and we would eventually name parts of the building. There's a Chaminade Hall there, and that's named Father Chaminade, who founded the Marianists, and St. Joseph Hall, Sisters of St. Joseph, and Brunner Hall, Mariana Brunner, who founded the Sisters of Precious Blood. So many of the residents there didn't know what some of those the names came from. The Franciscans eventually themselves would give $100,000. So we got the money. The feasibility study. Now Dick's former boss was a person by the name of Dick Yulee, who had recently retired, but he had become president of Ohio Presbyterian Homes, which is today called Ohio Living. They have several homes in Ohio. So he became a mentor for me and a coach for all of us, and he said that, the Presbyterians would do our feasibility study for us. because they did that sort of thing. So they did a feasibility study, and the feasibility study was done within that 90 days, and it said the project was very feasible for, I think, 3 issues. You need to raise money, do a lot of marketing, and I forget what the third one was. Oh, the sisters in those days worked for stipends. They weren't really salaried like they are today, so they would get pennies for doing their work. Like in the schools in those days, the nuns were teaching pretty much for nothing. So that those were all keys. Okay, so the feasibility study met, so the friars were good on that. And then zoning, Centerville is just always been very good to us, and we worked with J.V. Stone, and who was the mayor initially, and then Shirley Hines. We worked with her for years, and I forget the female mayor that followed her.
Sally Beals.
Mm-hmm. And then Mark Kingseed.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't work with him, but he was on the council all those days.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
all of those people have passed, as I understand it. But so they were very helpful, and I guess a key story in all in the success of St. Leonard's in the background here was just the generosity of people who wanted to make this work. Mm-hmm. And it was going to be and the boldness and daringness. I mean, the risk that the friars took, or might take, or that all of us, I mean, that were just volunteers taking the risk, or the people that would eventually move in there were taking a risk, like being the first person to move into that building. So in '82, late '82, they accepted, and they formed a corporation because we didn't even have a nonprofit organization. So they absorbed us into, we became a subsidiary of the Franciscan Order, and became in little things like, what do you want to call this? And we said, St. Leonard Center. That sounds good. Because I mean, they were going to pull the statue out of there. They were going. I mean, they had planned to leave. So we they gave us a 90-day option, or they said you completed this, so the place is now yours. So here are the keys. So we began. The first person I hired was a saintly nun. She had been, the first staff I hired, well, the youngest person was, I think, Rose, when she was in her 50s.
If you don't mind, how did you then become in charge?
Oh.
Let's go there, and then we'll go back to who you hired.
That's right, I skipped that. Well, we kind of were sitting in a room one day, and he says, who wants to be on the board? And people raised, Dickie Rose raised their hand, who wants to run the place? And they looked at me, and I said, let me talk it over with my wife. And I said, sure. So it was a risky venture here.
Yeah, I mean, so how did you feel brave enough to do that? I know this kind of takes us off.
I had no idea what I was doing. No, it just seemed like the right thing to do. Yeah. And it seemed very feasible. Mm-hmm. It was a career change. I was going from criminology to gerontology. So
you surrounded yourself with people who knew what they were doing.
Oh, they say, what is it? They say that great people are people who surround themselves with people who are greater. So I had a person like a Dick Yulee, who was president. One of the first things I did was that I had been doing was networking. Charlie Dilgard, who was one of the longtime founder of Otterbein Homes, Jerry Smart at Maple Knoll in Cincinnati, and I'm blanking on the individual at Bethany Lutheran. And all of these people couldn't have been more helpful because they just saw this as they didn't see us as a competitor then, which we would eventually become competitors, but they were people who were just really helpful in terms of advising us. So we one of the things that had happened in the interim is we hadn't lost sight of COPE, but we kind of wrote off the idea of putting a halfway house, a pre-release center for prisoners in the building, because warm and cheerful Centerville probably wouldn't be warm and cheerful if we did that. So that, but we started to the sister I was talking about who was hired, she was the first person to live in the building. So you have to appreciate as a nun in her 70s going to bed at night in an apartment in that building by herself that had 42 external doors. I mean, and we had a maintenance person who made sure, we had security and all this and that, but that's the boldness and the braveness of persons who would do this. And
trust in God, I'm assuming.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
and lots of funny stories. I remember one morning she, we were starting to hire. I mean, there was a sister Armella who we hired as a cook, and she, all of these sisters were coming out of retirement. Sister Rose would move in, but a couple of funny stories that happened when Sister Helenada was there. Right at the very beginning, she had she came to me in the morning, and she never got upset over anything. I mean, the building would be on fire, and she would calmly walk out. I mean, she was just so level-headed in her faith in God. So she told me someone was banging on her door in the middle of the night, and thought I should know. And so I looked into it, and as it turned out, it was a friar who had come back from the missions. I don't know if he was in Africa or somewhere, and nobody had told him the building was sold.
Oh, no.
He was trying to get in his old room.
Oh, no.
And then there was another instance where the person who was doing laundry came up and said, there's somebody downstairs boxing up all of our sheets and pillowcases and pillows and stuff, and is putting them in his car, and thought I should talk to him. And another case, he was in town on a retreat, and he was going back to Africa, and they really needed sheets and stuff, but nobody told him that the building had been sold.
This didn't belong to the Franciscans anymore.
I mean, yet it's like a worldwide group like that in those days, trying to keep everybody in the loop.
Yeah, without cell phones and
without cell phones. Yeah, that was a challenge. So we started hiring up, and then, of course, the volunteers that we needed, and we got money from the Iddings Foundation, and who were, I don't know, people know, if you've ever seen these big canisters that hang on the wall for fire suppression, I'm sure some of your listeners have. That's the Iddings Foundation invented those. And the Coons Brothers Foundations, a lot of those foundations in town had given us money. We didn't get anything from NCR, but because their planning was in the future, but they introduced us to a person by the name of Rex Smith. Now, Rex Smith was a high-ranking member of the military during the Second World War in public relations for the Army. And after that, he became vice president of marketing and public relations for Frigidaire, and eventually he worked for Needham Harper Steers Company. Well, he was, so basically NCR said, we can't give you any money, but we'll give you him. So he, for a modest amount of dollars, took over, because we had no marketing money, and we had to start getting the word out to what we were going to do. So he taught us, he says, well, you have to use public relations instead of marketing, so PR becomes your marketing. And he was a genius. So he would write and hand deliver all his press releases, and there were three TV channels and 2 newspapers in town in those days, and we never had an event there that didn't have all of them there. I mean, because he was so well respected. But he taught me, though, that what you have to have is you have to have a hook. If you're going to get the media there, you need a hook. And boy, he had some hooks. We had for a couple of groundbreakings, we had the world's largest groundbreaking, 200 residents with shovels, the Centerville High School band, the bishop, and the mayor. We had the same thing. We had the world's largest shovel. We had a hot air balloon launch. We had Dick Celeste came, who was a governor in those days, signed the Golden Buckeye Card legislation in the courtyard there. But in inimitable Rex Smith style, he had the Golden Buckeye Card was in the shape of a large, huge sheet cake which Dick Celeste signed in icing.
Okay.
I mean, the man was brilliant. So that was the sort of thing that was getting. Actually, we had an accepted. Rex and I were going to events, typically talking to the community, raising dollars, and I remember an instance where a woman walked up to us and said she had just heard so much about how people loved living there and everything. We hadn't accepted anybody yet.
But already there was a positive feeling about.
Oh yeah, he was
what you were doing.
So he was just such a blessing. So, and volunteers the building didn't have an elevator in it. It needed fire suppression systems, smoke detectors, all kinds of stuff like that. Plus, it needed painting and cleaning. So there's a Catholic church group, the Sunday community. I think they call themselves something different now, but they've worshipped there all along. And they were in the building. So what a godsend that they were cleaning rooms, painting rooms, getting rooms ready. For the first rooms were some of the nicer rooms, which was where the faculty were faculty rooms, and also lots of volunteers and some early donations from Christ United Methodist Church, who was a big supporter of ours from day one, and a couple of members, Bob Hadley, who's died not too long ago, was on our board. He became our legal counsel. But I remember a woman coming up to me, and she's they were cleaning rooms, and she says, I dearly love the Friars, but she says, I just spent the days with a razor blade scraping nicotine off the windows. So, because smoking in your room was no big.
Was very common.
Very common.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So all of these folks were working to get the building ready for people. So
for seniors.
So we started. We had some of the first people moving in were proud to they called themselves the pioneers, because they took the risk of moving into a place that was just getting off the ground. We rented space to Fifth Third Bank. We rented space because this was all revenue we needed. A beauty shop and a barber shop, a daycare center, an adult daycare center. Heritage Presbyterian Church started there. They were rented space there until they could afford to build a church. Of course, the other church that was there, we had, for a while, we had they used to have a DWI school where you'd have to spend a weekend. And we had that for a while until we found out that the coeducational piece of that wasn't working out the way we wanted it to. Mm-hmm. So we scrubbed that. Wedding receptions, we rented the soccer fields. We became the Dayton Lighter Than Air Society hot air balloon launch site. And going view the city council minutes, it wasn't long after that became an item.
They didn't want, or?
Well, they had not thought about that. I mean, and I don't know if there ever became any regulations with that. But so we had this going on. We stopped the wedding rehearsals after a few months. After a centerpiece caught fire and somebody tried to douse it with whiskey.
Oh my goodness!
and then the soccer fields worked good for a while, except that some of these soccer parents were running our residents off the road. So that was, but we were.
You were trying to make it work.
Yeah. And we had early on we had a fundraiser there for COPE. Back like when we still weren't quite sure what the relationship with them might be, and we had a prison arts and crafts show, where we brought arts and crafts from federal and state prisons in the Tri-County area and had a fair there, which eventually would become an annual judged art show there on the site. And one of the individuals at Lebanon did, in thankfulness to us, did a pen and ink silhouette of the building, which became our letterhead.
Oh. So
our first letterhead was done by a prisoner in Lebanon prison. So,
wow.
So we started building garden homes, and members and several people around here. In 85, by the way, 84, 85, the the south suburbs were getting flooded with. Sycamore was expanding. Well, of course, Otterbeин's a little further south, expanding. Bethany was expanding. Lincoln Park was being built. Several other retirement homes in the area were building. So this was all. Everybody had looked at the demographics, and the south suburb was the place to go, particularly for market rate housing. Mm-hmm. And we knew that we needed nursing home beds. At some point, we were going to need nursing home beds. Well, in Ohio, you have to have there's a certificate of need process. There's only so many beds allotted to every area. And like the ones in Montgomery County were all taken, so the only way you could get beds is if someone went out of business, and you would buy the beds, and just to get it's not really a license, but just to get to buy a bed on paper could be thousands of dollars. Mm-hmm. So it was brought to our attention that I don't know, the Mayor Hines or something told me, he says, by the way, do you know that they're building, I think it was AB and bigger or right around that area, that St. Elizabeth Hospital is building a retirement home there. And it's already, we just zoned it. They've purchased the property. It's called St. Elizabeth Retirement Center, Inc. So that was a milestone. That was like, here's another Catholic corporation building right in our backyard. So we made it a point of having a conversation with them just to find out what were their plans, and we needed beds. So this led to a lengthy conversation. This was 3 years later after we had founded, so the late 85, going into 86. That is there a way that we could work together? So our two boards started meeting, and like maybe when our people need nursing care, we can have them transported over to your place or something along those lines. So what and there were skeptics on both sides. They were concerned that we were too preoccupied with caring for the poor, and we were too concerned that they were too occupied with caring for the rich and market rate. So after some lengthy conversation, we agreed that we would become a subsidiary of the St. Elizabeth Corporation, so St. Leonard's, Inc. So we're keeping this nonprofit thing alive here. And so at that point in early 86, we became, St. Leonard Center became a subsidiary of St. Elizabeth Medical Center, which was part of the Franciscan health system. The Franciscan Sisters of the Poor health system, because there's a lot of Franciscan sisters, and they owned St. Elizabeth Medical Center, where my family was born there. It was the first hospital in Dayton. And then they had three hospitals in Cincinnati and 3 or 4 retirement homes in Cincinnati and Hamilton. So part of the deal was, though, that they had at this point there was 240 acres there, of which only 50. The Center 50 were nonprofit, was the nonprofit organization. The rest of it was just zoned farmland. It was farmed as
at St. Leonard's.
At St. Leonard.
Okay.
So they and the Friars were basically giving the building away, but you had to buy the property. So St. Elizabeth agreed to sell their property in Centerville and pay the Friars the market rate for that property. And upon doing that, then the Franciscans said, then if you'll buy that, then we'll donate another $100,000 to your benevolent fund, which we recall it the Archbishop Bernardine Benevolent Fund. So that set us off. So we then started doing, building the nursing home and dementia unit and Chaminade Hall, some of the other things, and did considerable expansion, and it became a good relationship. And one of the things that is still alive today that was part of the conversation early on is there were covenants attached to that property, and there still are covenants attached. The Friars said that, whoever has this property in perpetuity, some of the key things were there has to be provision for low income there. And one of our concerns from the day one was that nobody would be turned away because of lack of funds. So, and the second one was all the artwork there. The artwork is the friars still control. And you can actually take tours. The residents conduct tours there. There's several world-renowned artists whose art is displayed there throughout the grounds. You know, the frescoes and marble statues and mosaics. And I remember having a conversation that at the time, like, "Hey, we're all friends here. Why do we need these covenants?" And then I remember saying, you know, things happen, things change hands, and, which they have. So, so that got us to. So we kept expanding, and at one point we Archbishop Bernardine in Cincinnati, who is responsible for the 17 counties in southwest Ohio, are part of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati for Catholics. Oh, he went to Chicago and became a cardinal, and he had been a supporter all along for us. And we were building some tax credit housing for individuals, people who are of modest income, and I happened to be in Chicago on some other business, and he died that day. And I remember calling my board member and said, "We need to name this building after him." So the Leonard Center was named after him, and well, it was named after we got permission from his family to name it after him. And we also asked if they'd give us some. Is there something that we of him, picture anything that we could put on the wall? So they gave us a painting that had been done of him, which hangs in the wall over there. So, and so that got us up to about the time that the Franciscan system was purchased by the Mercy system in '99. So that's the Cliff Notes.
That's the Cliff Notes version of how it came about.
How it and it was a true nonprofit. I remember a staff meeting at our house, and the friars would always come dressed in robes, and my little 4 or 5-year-old son walked up to one of them and wanted to know if he was God. And because of his brown robes, he said, "Are you God?" So and just setting up a card table with a rendering on it in the parking lot while my kids played in the cornfield, selling cottages and garden homes. So it, but again, it was the huge generosity of the Franciscans in giving that building to the community. And actually, when they first came here, they brought a lot of utilities out to Centerville. I mean, they brought some the extra power and water and sewage capabilities. I mean, when I grew up in west side of Dayton, we had a great aunt who lived out here, and anytime we went to Centerville, I mean, we'd check the tires and and put a blanket in the trunk, and because we were it was like going on a long trip. And there's actually some video of that open house that is available. It's narrated. I don't know if it's on what kind of. I think it may still be on VHS tape of cars going. Somebody was on the roof that filmed this, and cars going out this narrow Clio road was. I don't know. It wasn't dirt in those days. It was close to it for the original. The construction of the building and the opening. There was a couple of things that happened, and there was the bell tower we were going to tear down because it was structurally unsound. They had made a tubular steel tower and then coated it with brick. So after a while, the bricks were falling off. But somebody came up with $50,000 to save the bell tower. So there's just all kinds of stories that went along with that. But just people who took steps to, Dick has passed away a while back, and so did Sister Rose, but they went on after leaving. They left St. Leonard shortly after that, where their heart was really in low-income housing, and they went down to Dayton to found St. Mary's Housing and built housing all around the city. So they continued their mission there. So great people.
Yeah, and what did you do after you stopped working there?
In '99, when the Franciscan Sisters of the Poor were purchased, and St. E's and all that was purchased by the Sisters of Mercy, they asked me if I would. At that point, I was already running. I was running St. Leonard's, and I was also a regional person for their other facilities in Cincinnati. So there's about 4 or 5 facilities that I was responsible for, along with St. Leonard's. They were buying all those and wanted me to come along and run them, and I said, yeah, I'd happy to do that. Well, that piece, the St. Leonard, the Dayton piece fell apart, and it mainly because St. E's was closing, and nobody wanted to, and you couldn't get one without the other. I mean, just putting it very simply, there were some bonds due on that hospital, and so it was a couple of years later that another Franciscan order of the Sisters came to the rescue, as it were, and helped resolve that deal and purchased St. Leonard's. So I ended up, I wasn't leaving St. Leonard's, but I ended up, it kind of got cut off, as it were. So
because somebody else was in charge.
Yeah, a different order bought it. But then of course, we ended up, the Mercies there, we ended up with, was it 5 facilities in Cincinnati, 1 in Louisville, and 1 in Indiana. So it was a lot of fun, a lot of good work.
Yeah, it sounds like you had a lot of good memories. I love how you mentioned how your children were involved, and as we often do, our kids become involved in our work, and I'm sure that they spent much time there as well.
Oh yeah, my daughter worked in the dining room at one point, and my son mowed grass. And I remember when she went to Miami, she worked at Oxford View Nursing Home there because she enjoyed that, and so.
Yeah, I'm sure it's been an employer for the community. A
lot of kids.
Years. Mm-hmm.
Centerville High School kids work there, so it's been St. Leonard's is still a major business in Centerville.
And there's been a lot of events that I've gone there. My kids have done talent shows there through the schools, and then there's been Centerville-Washington history. We're very involved in bringing speakers or artifacts there. So I know that it's been and is still a very big part of our community. And thank you for sharing that story. Is there any other parts of your working there that
I have fond memories of Howard Hauser, who was a Centerville historian.
Yes.
He was one of the first movers, and we used to smoke cigars on his porch. And he was such wise counsel, and he was the one that informed me that we had Indian mounds on the property.
Oh, okay.
And that was way back when, and we had them, looked at, and they had already been ravaged by that point. They were small, but he was just he wrote a narrative. I think you have on file somewhere of the history of the entire property there. There's supposedly it was on part of the Underground Railroad, or there may have been at one point slaves that may have worked on the property, and there may have been slaves who were rescued on their way going up north to the Wilberforce area or that sort of thing. So,
yes, he was very important for writing and researching our history, and appreciate that people. That's what we're kind of doing here, is we're kind of making more of an oral history, and so definitely St. Leonard's is part of that oral history, and because you were there from the beginning, you're part of that oral history.
Yes, I feel like I've become part of that history. Yeah,
definitely you have, and it's fascinating to hear. How you became involved in caring for the elderly, and especially those that have struggle with having enough money to care for themselves in their older years, and that's definitely a worthwhile.
And they still carry it on. I just am delighted. It's always nice to come back every once in a while, but they're just doing so many wonderful things, and still a lot of people there that were there when I was here, so people are living longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if they take care of themselves, hopefully that continues.
That's it. Yeah.
That's the key. And good genetics, too.
Right, that helps. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and
pleasure.
Sharing that story. It was delightful to get to know you a little bit. And also, thank you to MVCC for helping to produce this podcast, and of course to my guest, Brian Forschner. If you have an interesting story about Centerville or Washington Township, please contact Centerville-Washington History. Please also come visit our museums, Uptown Centerville, Tuesday through Friday, 12 o'clock to 4 p.m. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram and watch for upcoming events posted on our website, centervillewashingtonhistory.org. Thank you and goodbye.